January 17, 1943. A frozen forest 20 kilometers east of Smolensk, Soviet Union. The temperature had dropped to minus 32 degrees Celsius during the night, cold enough that breath crystallized instantly, cold enough that exposed skin turned white with frostbite in minutes. In a shallow depression beneath a stand of birch trees, 23-year-old Red Army Lieutenant Alexei Volkov crouched behind the remains of a fallen trunk, his Mosin-Nagant rifle across his knees, his fingers too numb to feel the trigger. He had been separated from his unit for 3 days. Not lost, separated. There's a difference. Lost implies confusion, panic, a failure of navigation. Separated means you know exactly where you should be, and circumstances have made it impossible to get there. Volkov's rifle company had been conducting reconnaissance in force when German positions erupted with coordinated machine gun fire. The Soviet advance dissolved into chaos. Men scattered into the forest. Some ran toward their own lines. Others simply ran. Volkov had pulled 2 wounded soldiers behind a snow bank, used his last field dressing on a sucking chest wound, and watched both men die before sunset. Then he moved east, toward where Soviet lines should have been, using only darkness for cover. But the Germans had pushed forward overnight. The front line had shifted. The safe ground he was moving toward no longer existed. For 3 days he had moved through frozen forest, avoiding German patrols, drinking melted snow, eating nothing. His greatcoat was torn. His boots were coming apart. His ammunition pouches held 17 rounds. He had decided that morning that he would try to reach Soviet positions by nightfall or surrender. The cold was going to kill him otherwise. Dying of exposure was worse than capture. At least prisoners of war sometimes survived. Then he heard German voices. 2 soldiers, maybe 3, moving through the trees from the north. Volkov pressed himself flat against frozen ground, his rifle sight trained on the sound. The voices grew closer. He could hear boots crunching through snow crust, could hear one soldier complaining about the cold in accented German. 3 Wehrmacht soldiers emerged from the tree line 30 meters away. They were conducting their own reconnaissance, moving carefully, weapons ready. They wore winter camouflage smocks over their field gray uniforms. One carried an MP-40 submachine gun. Another had a rifle. The third, an older man with a weathered face, carried a rifle and what looked like a map case. They hadn't seen him yet. Volkov's finger tightened on his trigger. He could take 1, maybe 2 before they returned fire. But there were 3 of them, and he had 17 rounds, and he hadn't eaten in 3 days. His hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion. He would miss. They would kill him. Or worse, wound him and leave him to freeze. The German with the map case stopped. He was looking directly at Volkov's position. Not at Volkov himself, but at the fallen tree, at the slight depression where a man might hide. The other 2 Germans stopped as well, following their companion's gaze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Volkov could see the German's breath misting in the frozen air. He could see the frost on the man's eyebrows, the ice crystals on his collar. The German raised his hand slowly. Not in surrender. Not in greeting. Just raised it. Palm out. A gesture that meant nothing and everything. Then he turned to his companions and spoke. Volkov couldn't hear the words clearly, but he heard the tone. Calm. Firm. Not urgent. The 3 Germans turned and walked away, back into the forest, leaving Volkov untouched. Volkov lay in the snow for 10 minutes after they disappeared, his rifle still aimed at empty forest, his mind trying to understand what had just happened. German soldiers had seen him. They had been close enough to kill him easily. He had been separated, exhausted, half-frozen, no threat to anyone. And they had walked away. They had simply walked away. For the next 4 hours, Volkov moved through the forest like a ghost, putting distance between himself and where those German soldiers might return with reinforcements. Every step was calculated. Every sound examined. He couldn't afford to believe in mercy. Mercy was a luxury of peacetime. In war, mercy got you killed. Those Germans had made a mistake. Or they had been toying with him. Or there was some tactical reason for letting him live that he didn't understand yet. But as the afternoon wore on and no German patrol appeared, as he continued east without incident, as the cold worked deeper into his bones and his thoughts became sluggish with exhaustion and hunger, a different understanding began to form. Those Germans hadn't made a mistake. They had made a choice. They had seen a half-frozen enemy soldier who posed no threat and they had chosen not to kill him. War creates strange moments of recognition between enemies. Moments when the machinery of violence pauses and two human beings see each other across the divide of nationality and ideology and uniform. Moments when one person makes a decision that defies military logic, defies orders, defies everything they've been trained to believe about the enemy. Those 3 German soldiers had experienced such a moment. And Volkov had been the beneficiary. The German soldier with the map case had recognized something. Perhaps he'd seen that Volkov was barely alive, that killing him would have been less combat than execution. Perhaps he'd calculated that a half-frozen Soviet lieutenant stumbling through German-controlled forest posed less danger than the gunfire that killing him would generate. Perhaps he was simply tired of killing. After 2 years on the Eastern Front, after seeing entire cities reduced to rubble and entire armies destroyed, perhaps he'd reached some internal limit and decided that one more death was one death too many. Volkov would never know the German's reasoning. But he was alive because of it. He had woken that morning expecting to die, either from cold or from capture or from combat. Instead, 3 enemy soldiers had seen him and walked away. They had given him something more valuable than food or warmth or ammunition. They had given him time. Time to keep moving. Time to find safety. Time to survive one more day. As darkness began to fall on January 17, 1943, Volkov spotted movement ahead through the trees. He dropped flat, bringing his rifle up, then recognized Soviet uniforms. Soviet soldiers. His own army. He had reached friendly lines. He rose slowly, hands visible, rifle pointed at the ground, and called out the recognition signal. The Soviet soldiers turned, weapons raised, suspicious. Volkov identified himself, gave his unit designation, his commander's name. One soldier stepped forward to verify his identity while others kept him covered. The soldier checking his papers looked at Volkov's condition, the torn coat, the disintegrating boots, the frost-blackened fingers, the sunken eyes, and asked a simple question: "How long have you been separated?" 3 days, Volkov replied. The soldier nodded and handed back his papers. 3 days alone in German-controlled forest in winter. It was almost impossible. But here he stood. Alive. The Soviet soldiers brought him to a field command post dug into a hillside 2 kilometers behind the front line. They gave him hot soup, black bread, and vodka. They gave him dry boots and a replacement greatcoat. They questioned him about German positions, troop movements, anything he'd observed during his 3 days behind enemy lines. Volkov answered automatically, describing patrol patterns and defensive positions, providing what limited tactical information he'd gathered. But he didn't mention the 3 German soldiers who had seen him and walked away. Not during the initial debriefing. Not during the more detailed questioning that came later. He told them about the combat that had separated him from his unit, about moving through frozen forest, about hiding and moving and surviving. But that moment beneath the birch trees, that moment when a German soldier raised his hand and chose mercy over murder, that moment remained private. Volkov couldn't have explained why he kept silent. Perhaps he feared they wouldn't believe him. Perhaps he feared they would believe him but interpret his survival as cowardice rather than luck. Perhaps he simply couldn't find words for what had happened, couldn't translate that wordless gesture into official military language. Or perhaps, on some level he couldn't articulate, he understood that what those German soldiers had given him was meant to remain unnamed. A gift given in silence, to be carried in silence. Lieutenant Alexei Volkov returned to active duty with his rifle company 4 days after reaching Soviet lines. The wound he'd sustained during the initial engagement that separated him from his unit, a deep gash across his left forearm from shrapnel, had not yet fully healed, but the field doctor cleared him for service. Manpower was critical. Every able-bodied soldier was needed. Volkov's fingers still showed signs of minor frostbite, but he could hold a rifle. That was sufficient. His company commander, Captain Dmitry Sokolov, greeted his return with typical Soviet stoicism. No celebration of survival. No questions beyond the tactical. Sokolov assigned Volkov to defensive positions along the company's sector of the front line, told him to rest when possible, and return to the endless work of keeping undermanned, undersupplied units combat effective. But Volkov noticed something in the days following his return. His fellow soldiers treated him differently. Not with hostility. Not with suspicion. But with a certain careful distance. Men who had fought beside him for months now avoided prolonged conversation. They were polite, professional, but reserved. It took Volkov several days to understand why. He had survived when others had not. The 2 wounded soldiers he tried to save had died. 6 other men from his platoon had been killed in the same engagement. 3 more were missing, presumed captured or dead. And Volkov had walked out of German-controlled forest after 3 days. Alone. Unhurt beyond minor frostbite and an earlier wound. There were no accusations. No one suggested cowardice or collaboration. But there were questions unspoken. Questions about luck and survival and what it meant that some men died while others lived. Volkov felt these questions in the silences, in the way conversations stopped when he approached, in the careful distance his comrades maintained. He found himself thinking about those 3 German soldiers more frequently. Not during combat. Not when focused on immediate survival. But in the quiet hours before sleep, when the mind wanders and memory resurfaces. He saw the German soldier's face clearly, weathered, tired, the face of a man in his mid-30s who had seen too much war. He saw that raised hand. That gesture of recognition. He tried to understand it through different frameworks. Military logic. Political ideology. Personal psychology. Nothing fit completely. War taught you that the enemy was inhuman. That Germans were fascists, barbarians, monsters who burned villages and shot prisoners. That killing them was not just necessary but righteous. Every briefing, every propaganda poster, every political officer's speech reinforced this understanding. The enemy was evil. Your cause was just. There was no middle ground. No complexity. No room for moments when a German soldier might see a Soviet soldier and choose not to kill him. But Volkov had experienced such a moment. And it had shattered something in his understanding of the war. Not his commitment to fighting. Not his belief in Soviet victory. But his ability to see the enemy as purely evil, as fundamentally different from himself. Those 3 German soldiers had been cold too. Tired too. Probably hungry, probably exhausted, probably wondering if they would survive the day. And when they'd seen an enemy soldier who posed no threat, they had made a human choice. They had chosen mercy. Volkov never spoke of this realization. Speaking it would have made him vulnerable to accusations of defeatism or worse. In Stalin's army, expressing any complexity about the enemy could be interpreted as weakness or disloyalty. Political officers watched for exactly such signs. Soldiers disappeared for less. So Volkov kept his thoughts private and focused on his duties. He manned his sector of the line. He participated in raids. He followed orders. He survived. But the knowledge that he owed his life to enemy mercy changed something fundamental in how he approached the war. Not in obvious ways. Not in ways anyone could observe or report. But in small internal shifts that accumulated over time. When he had German soldiers in his rifle sight now, he still pulled the trigger. War didn't allow the luxury of individual mercy. But he no longer hated them with the pure, simple hatred that had sustained him before. He killed them because it was his duty, because the war required it, because his survival and his comrades' survival depended on it. But he couldn't hate them the way he had before January 17, 1943. The Eastern Front continued its brutal grinding through 1943. Cities changed hands. Hundreds of thousands died. Armies advanced and retreated across landscapes so devastated that no feature remained recognizable. Volkov fought through it all, accumulating the experience that transformed raw soldiers into veterans. He learned to sleep during artillery barrages. He learned to distinguish incoming shells from outgoing by sound alone. He learned which soldiers would break under pressure and which would hold. He learned that courage and cowardice were not fixed traits but fluid states that changed with circumstances. He was promoted to senior lieutenant in April after his company commander was killed by sniper fire. By June he was commanding what remained of the company himself, 43 men from an authorized strength of 120. They fought through mud in spring, through dust in summer, through the grinding urban combat of autumn. Volkov learned command the hard way, through mistakes that got men killed and lessons paid for in blood. He learned that leadership meant making decisions knowing they would result in casualties, that the best choice was often choosing which men died rather than whether men died. Through all of this, through 20 months of continuous combat, that moment beneath the birch trees remained with him. Not as memory that replayed frequently. Not as something he consciously thought about. But as a kind of foundation, a baseline understanding against which other experiences were measured. Those German soldiers had not been monsters. They had been men like him, capable of mercy and murder both. This knowledge didn't make the war less brutal. It made it more complex. More morally ambiguous. Harder to process through the simple frameworks that propaganda and ideology provided. In September 1944, Volkov's unit participated in the liberation of a Polish village that had been under German occupation for 3 years. The village had been destroyed, buildings burned, civilians murdered, the entire population either killed or deported. His soldiers moved through empty streets between charred buildings, past cellars where resistance fighters had been tortured, past mass graves in the church courtyard. The evidence of atrocity was overwhelming. Undeniable. This was what German occupation meant. This was what the enemy did when they controlled territory. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Grigory Petrov, stood beside him looking at the ruins and spoke what everyone was thinking: animals. Worse than animals. Animals don't do this to their own kind. The other soldiers nodded agreement. And Volkov found himself silent, unable to agree completely, unable to explain why. Because he had seen German soldiers who were capable of this. And he had seen German soldiers who chose mercy when they could have chosen murder. Both things were true simultaneously. The enemy was capable of extraordinary cruelty and unexpected humanity both. Acknowledging this didn't excuse the atrocities. But it made simple hatred impossible. That evening, Volkov's unit captured 3 German soldiers who had been left behind when their unit retreated. Young men, terrified, expecting execution. Standard Soviet practice by this point in the war, after 3 years of German atrocities, was to shoot captured Germans unless they had immediate intelligence value. The men had nothing useful. They were infantry soldiers, cut off from their unit, armed only with rifles and a handful of ammunition. They had surrendered when challenged, hands raised, begging for mercy in broken Russian. Lieutenant Petrov looked at Volkov, waiting for orders. The 3 German soldiers knelt in the mud, hands behind their heads, shaking. Volkov thought about January 17, 1943. About 3 German soldiers who could have killed him and chose not to. About mercy given when mercy made no sense. About that raised hand. That gesture of recognition. He told Petrov to process the prisoners according to regulation. Take their weapons. Take their papers. Send them to the rear for interrogation. Petrov looked surprised. Usually captured Germans were dealt with more immediately, but followed orders. The 3 German soldiers were disarmed, their hands bound, and they were marched away toward the rear under guard. 2 days later, Volkov learned that all 3 had been shot by an NKVD officer during transport. Standard practice. Enemy combatants. No intelligence value. Waste of resources to guard them. Volkov felt something when he heard this news. Not quite guilt. He'd followed regulations. He'd done what military law required. But something else. A sense of failure. Those 3 German soldiers had surrendered hoping for mercy and received none. And he had been in a position to offer them something, not freedom, not life, but at least temporary safety, and the system had overridden him. The choice had been taken from his hands. By April 1945, Captain Alexei Volkov, he'd been promoted to captain in January after distinguished service during the Vistula-Oder offensive, commanded a rifle company advancing through eastern Germany toward Berlin. His unit had been fighting almost continuously for 4 years. The men were exhausted. The officers were exhausted. Everyone was exhausted. But the end was visible now. Germany was collapsing. The 1,000-year Reich would be measured in months, not millennia. The landscape through which they moved showed the consequences of total war. Cities reduced to rubble. Refugees clogging roads. German units surrendering in thousands. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating, no longer capable of coordinated resistance. What remained were isolated defensive positions manned by soldiers who fought because they had nowhere left to retreat, because surrender meant uncertain fate, because dying in defense of Germany seemed preferable to the alternatives. Volkov's company encountered German soldiers almost daily. Some fought. Some surrendered. Some simply disappeared into the chaos of collapse, abandoning their weapons and uniforms and melting into the civilian population. The rules of engagement had become fluid. Soviet command expected aggression. Expected speed. Expected the final destruction of German military power. But on the ground, among the ruins and the refugees and the exhausted soldiers on both sides, something more complex was happening. Individual Soviet soldiers were making individual choices about which Germans to kill and which to let surrender. Officers were making choices about which positions to assault and which to bypass. The war was becoming personal again, not in the sense of hatred but in the sense of human judgment. After 4 years of mechanized slaughter, after millions of deaths, after entire cities obliterated, the soldiers who had survived this far were tired of killing. Given the choice between accepting a surrender and fighting to the last man, most chose surrender. Not because of mercy. Because of exhaustion. But Volkov saw exceptions. Saw Soviet soldiers shooting surrendering Germans out of hatred or revenge or simple rage at everything the war had cost. Saw civilians murdered by soldiers who had stopped distinguishing between enemy combatants and enemy population. Saw atrocities committed by men who had become capable of atrocity through exposure to atrocity. The brutalization was mutual. Soviet soldiers had seen what Germans did to Soviet territory. German soldiers had seen what Soviets did to German territory. The cycle of violence had created soldiers on both sides who were no longer entirely human, who had lost the capacity for mercy that most people are born with. And yet, even in this landscape of total brutalization, moments of unexpected humanity occurred. Volkov witnessed a Soviet lieutenant sharing his rations with German prisoners who hadn't eaten in days. Saw a Soviet medic treating wounded German soldiers with the same care he gave to Soviet wounded. Heard stories of Soviet units allowing German medical personnel safe passage through lines to reach wounded. These moments were rare. But they existed. Small acts of mercy in an ocean of violence. One afternoon in mid-April, Volkov's company captured a German major who had been commanding the defense of a small town. The major was professional, dignified, and completely forthcoming about his unit's dispositions and strength. He'd surrendered when his ammunition ran out, recognizing that further resistance was pointless. He was in his mid-30s, educated, articulate. He spoke some Russian. He asked to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. He knew this was unlikely but asked anyway. During the interrogation, the German major mentioned that he'd served on the Eastern Front since 1941. 4 years of war. He'd been at Smolensk in 1941. At Moscow. At Stalingrad. He'd survived everything the Red Army could throw at German forces and now here he was, captured 50 kilometers from Berlin, the war effectively over. There was a kind of bitter satisfaction in his voice. He'd survived. Against all odds, through 4 years of the most brutal combat in human history, he'd survived. Volkov asked him, carefully, conversationally, not as part of the official interrogation, whether he'd ever let Soviet prisoners go. Whether he'd ever chosen mercy when he could have chosen murder. The German major looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said yes. Once. Early in the war, during the advance on Moscow. A Soviet soldier, badly wounded, separated from his unit. Could have shot him. Should have shot him. But didn't. Walked away. Told himself it was tactical decision, that the wounded Soviet would die anyway from his injuries, that shooting him would waste ammunition and create noise. But he knew, even then, that it was mercy. Weakness, perhaps. But mercy. Volkov didn't ask if that Soviet soldier had survived. Didn't ask what the German major's unit had been doing in January 1943 near Smolensk. The timing was wrong. The circumstances different. But for a moment, Volkov allowed himself to imagine that this man had been one of those 3 German soldiers. That he was looking at the face of the man who had chosen to let him live. The fantasy was impossible. But in that moment, facing this exhausted enemy officer who had survived the same war Volkov had survived, who had made similar choices under similar pressures, who had somehow retained enough humanity to occasionally choose mercy, Volkov felt something he hadn't felt before. Recognition. Not forgiveness. Not friendship. But recognition that they were more similar than different. Two men shaped by the same terrible war. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Volkov's company was still in eastern Germany when the ceasefire came. The men received the news with relief more than celebration. They had survived. The unimaginable had occurred, they had outlived the war. Most had expected to die. Many of their comrades had died. But they personally, individually, had survived. The relief was overwhelming. The joy more complicated. Volkov remained in Germany as part of the Soviet occupation force for 18 months after the war ended. This period was strange, disorienting. He was still a captain commanding a rifle company, but now his duties involved occupation administration rather than combat. Maintaining order. Processing refugees. Managing interactions between Soviet forces and German civilians. It required a different kind of skill than combat command. Required talking instead of shooting. Required making decisions based on regulations and policy rather than immediate tactical necessity. The German civilians he encountered were complex. Some were clearly former Nazis, unrepentant, bitter about defeat. Others were ordinary people who claimed they'd never supported Hitler, had never known about the camps, had just been trying to survive like everyone else. Some were probably truthful. Others were lying. Volkov found he lacked the ability to judge definitively. After 4 years of war, after seeing what both sides were capable of, he no longer trusted simple judgments about guilt and innocence. He tried, once, to find the 3 German soldiers who had let him live in January 1943. It was a futile effort. He had no names, no unit designations, only a memory of faces. Even if they'd survived the war, unlikely given casualty rates on the Eastern Front, finding them among millions of German soldiers would have been impossible. He abandoned the search after a few half-hearted inquiries. What would he have said to them anyway? Thank you for not killing me. The absurdity of it stopped him. You don't thank enemy soldiers for showing mercy. You simply carry the memory. In October 1946, Volkov was rotated back to the Soviet Union and demobilized. He returned to his hometown, a small city in the Urals that had been transformed by wartime industry. Factories that had been evacuated from western regions operated continuously. The population had swelled with refugees and evacuees. Nothing was quite as he remembered it. His mother had died during the war. His younger brother had been killed at Kursk. His father, who had worked in a munitions factory throughout the war, had aged decades in 4 years. Volkov tried to resume civilian life. The state found him work as an administrator in a textile factory. He married a young woman named Katya who worked in the factory's accounting department. They had a daughter in 1948. He attended party meetings, fulfilled his civic duties, lived quietly. To observers, he appeared to have successfully transitioned from military to civilian life. But he carried the war with him in ways that were invisible to outsiders. He never spoke about January 17, 1943. Not to his wife. Not to his daughter as she grew older. Not to other veterans who gathered occasionally to remember the war. He couldn't have explained why those 3 German soldiers had chosen not to kill him, so he said nothing. The incident remained private. Personal. A memory that defied the official narrative of the war as simple struggle between good and evil. The Soviet Union's official history of the Great Patriotic War had no room for complex moral questions. No room for moments when enemy soldiers showed mercy. No room for the uncomfortable truth that men capable of atrocity were also capable of humanity. The narrative was clean, clear, unambiguous. The Soviet people had fought a defensive war against fascist invasion. They had suffered terrible losses. They had prevailed through courage and sacrifice. The enemy had been evil. Soviet forces had been heroic. Victory had been inevitable once the Soviet people were fully mobilized. This narrative wasn't entirely false. But it was incomplete. It left no space for the messy reality of individual experience, for the moments that didn't fit the larger story. Volkov understood why the official history needed simplicity. A nation that had lost over 27 million people needed clear reasons why such sacrifice had been necessary. Needed to believe the cause had been just and the enemy irredeemable. Ambiguity was unbearable. Complexity was dangerous. But Volkov carried complexity anyway. Carried it silently, privately, in the space between his official identity as a decorated war veteran and his internal understanding of what the war had actually been. He had killed German soldiers. Many of them. He'd followed orders that resulted in civilian deaths. He'd participated in a war of annihilation. He wasn't innocent. But he also knew that the Germans he'd killed had been men like him, that some of them had been capable of mercy, that the line between human and monster was thinner and more permeable than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Alexei Volkov died in 1989, shortly before the Soviet Union's collapse. He was 70 years old. He'd lived through revolution, industrialization, the Great Patriotic War, Stalin's final years, Khrushchev's thaw, Brezhnev's stagnation, the early years of Gorbachev's reforms. He'd seen his country change dramatically multiple times. He'd raised a daughter who became a teacher, had 2 grandchildren, lived long enough to see Glasnost begin opening conversations about Soviet history that had been closed for decades. In his final years, as the Soviet system's rigidity began to crack, as previously forbidden topics became discussable, Volkov considered telling someone about January 17, 1943. About 3 German soldiers and 1 Soviet lieutenant and a moment of mercy that had saved a life. But he never did. The habit of silence was too deeply ingrained. The fear that his survival through enemy mercy might be interpreted as cowardice or collaboration remained, even as the political system that had enforced such fears began to crumble. He died without speaking of it. The story of those 3 German soldiers who had seen an enemy soldier and chosen not to kill him died with him. His daughter sorted through his possessions after the funeral, military medals, official documents, a few photographs, and found nothing that hinted at the incident. No journal entry. No letter. No physical evidence that the moment had occurred. It was as if it had never happened. But it had happened. On January 17, 1943, in a frozen forest east of Smolensk, 3 Wehrmacht soldiers had made a choice. They had seen an enemy soldier who posed no threat and they had walked away. They had given him life. And that gift had rippled forward through decades. Through Volkov's survival of the war, through his daughter's birth in 1948, through his grandchildren's lives. Because 3 German soldiers made a human choice in an inhuman war, people existed who otherwise wouldn't have. A daughter. 2 grandchildren. Eventually, great-grandchildren. An entire lineage that began with mercy. The 3 German soldiers probably didn't survive the war. Eastern Front casualty rates were catastrophic for both sides. The Wehrmacht soldier with the map case who had raised his hand in that wordless gesture probably died in some later battle, probably was buried in some unmarked grave or left unburied on some forgotten battlefield. His name is lost. His face is lost. His identity is lost to history. But his choice echoed forward. His mercy had consequences that extended far beyond that frozen morning. War is usually remembered through its violence. Through battles and casualties and strategic turning points. Through the great movements of armies and the decisions of commanders. Through the machinery of slaughter and the statistics of death. This is appropriate. War is primarily about violence. But war also contains moments like January 17, 1943. Moments when the machinery pauses. When individual human beings make choices that affirm their humanity despite everything the war has done to destroy it. These moments are rare. They don't change the outcome of campaigns. They don't alter grand strategy. They don't appear in official histories. They're too small, too personal, too ambiguous to fit the narratives nations construct about their wars. But they matter to the individuals involved. They matter to the people who wouldn't exist if different choices had been made. They matter because they demonstrate that even in the worst circumstances humans create, individual humans retain the capacity for unexpected decency. The story of Lieutenant Alexei Volkov and 3 nameless German soldiers is not unique. Similar moments occurred thousands of times during World War II. Soviet soldiers showing mercy to captured Germans. German soldiers showing mercy to captured Soviets. American soldiers showing mercy to captured Japanese. Japanese soldiers showing mercy to captured Americans. British soldiers showing mercy to captured Italians. These moments happened despite official policy, despite propaganda, despite everything both sides said about the enemy. They happened because soldiers on both sides remained, fundamentally, human. Most of these stories were never recorded. The soldiers involved, like Volkov, kept silent about them. Sometimes from fear of reprisal. Sometimes from inability to explain moments that defied the official narrative. Sometimes simply because there were no words adequate to describe what it meant to receive mercy from an enemy, to be given life when death was expected, to be recognized as human by someone you'd been taught to see as inhuman. But silence doesn't erase reality. These moments occurred whether or not they were documented. Men showed mercy to enemies. Men chose not to kill when they could have killed. Men made human choices in inhuman circumstances. And those choices mattered. They saved lives. They demonstrated that the dehumanization war requires is never complete. They proved that individual conscience could survive institutional brutality. January 17, 1943. A frozen forest 20 kilometers east of Smolensk. A Soviet lieutenant behind a fallen tree. 3 German soldiers who see him and walk away. 46 years later, that Soviet lieutenant dies in his sleep in a small city in the Urals, having never spoken of what happened that morning. The story dies with him. Except it doesn't. Not entirely. Because every story of mercy given in wartime, whether recorded or lost, contributes to our understanding of what war actually is. Not just slaughter. Not just hatred. But also, occasionally, humanity. The choices individual people make when all the structures and rules that normally govern behavior have collapsed. We remember World War II through its battles. Stalingrad. Kursk. Normandy. Berlin. We remember it through its casualties, over 60 million dead. We remember it through its atrocities, the Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, the bombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We remember it as the worst thing humans have done to each other, the most total war, the most comprehensive mobilization of violence in human history. All of this is true. But it's not the complete truth. Because alongside the violence and hatred and systematic murder, individual people kept making individual choices to show mercy. To refrain from killing when killing was expected. To recognize an enemy as human when dehumanization was required. These choices didn't stop the war. They didn't prevent atrocities. They didn't change the outcome of campaigns. But they saved individual lives. And those lives mattered. Alexei Volkov's daughter never knew that her existence began with 3 German soldiers making a human choice. She taught Russian literature in a secondary school for 40 years, influenced hundreds of students, lived a quiet life. Her existence was contingent on mercy shown to her father by enemy soldiers. But she never knew this. The story was lost. The moment was forgotten. But forgetting doesn't erase causation. Those 3 German soldiers saved Volkov's life on January 17, 1943. That choice rippled forward through time, creating consequences they never saw, saving lives they never knew about, demonstrating humanity they probably never thought about again. They made a choice in a moment. That moment had permanent consequences. War teaches us to dehumanize enemies. It's necessary for combat effectiveness. Necessary for maintaining morale. Necessary for sustaining the violence that war requires. But dehumanization is never complete. Even in total war, even after years of brutality, even in the worst circumstances, individual humans retain the capacity to see other individuals as human. To choose mercy over murder. To make human choices in inhuman situations. These moments are exceptions. They're rare. They don't define the character of war. War is primarily about violence and suffering and death. But the exceptions matter. They matter because they demonstrate that the line between human and monster is maintained through individual choices, not through nationality or ideology or uniform. German soldiers were capable of showing mercy to Soviet soldiers. Soviet soldiers were capable of showing mercy to German soldiers. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides also showed mercy. Both things were possible simultaneously. The story of Lieutenant Alexei Volkov and 3 nameless German soldiers represents millions of untold stories from World War II. Moments of unexpected humanity that occurred despite everything, that saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, that demonstrated that even total war couldn't entirely destroy human capacity for mercy. Most of these stories were never recorded. Most died with the people who experienced them. Most are lost to history. But they happened. Men showed mercy to enemies. Men chose not to kill when they could have killed. Men made human choices when everything around them encouraged inhuman choices. And those choices mattered. They saved lives. They affirmed humanity. They demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances humans create, individual humans can choose to be decent. We'll never know the names of those 3 German soldiers who let Volkov live. We'll never know if they survived the war. We'll never know if they made similar choices on other occasions or if January 17, 1943 was unique. We'll never know if they remembered that frozen morning or if it was just another day in 4 years of war. We'll never know if they understood what they'd given Volkov or if they thought about it at all. But we know they made a choice. We know that choice saved a life. We know that life had consequences, a daughter, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, hundreds of students taught, connections made, a quiet existence that began because 3 enemy soldiers chose mercy. We know that mercy matters. Even in war. Even between enemies. Even when unrecorded and unremembered and lost to history. Mercy matters. That's what January 17, 1943 means. Not that war is redeemed by occasional mercy. Not that individual good acts compensate for systematic violence. But that even in total war, even after years of brutalization, even in frozen forests behind enemy lines, human beings sometimes choose to be human. They recognize each other across the divide of enmity. They make choices that affirm life over death. They demonstrate that conscience survives even when everything tries to destroy it. Alexei Volkov carried this knowledge for 46 years. Carried it silently, privately, unable to speak it. He died with it unspoken. The story died with him. But the reality endures. On January 17, 1943, 3 German soldiers saw a Soviet soldier and walked away. They gave him life. That gift rippled forward through decades, creating consequences they never knew about, saving lives they never saw, demonstrating something fundamental about human nature that war tries but fails to completely destroy. The frozen forest east of Smolensk is just forest now. The war's scars have healed. The trenches have filled in. The battlefields have returned to farming. Nothing marks the spot where a Soviet lieutenant lay behind a fallen tree and German soldiers chose mercy. There's no monument. No plaque. No recognition. The moment is lost. The men are dead. The story is forgotten. But it happened. And it mattered. And somewhere in Russia today, people live who exist because 3 enemy soldiers made a human choice on a frozen morning in 1943. They don't know this. They never will. But it's true. Their existence began with mercy. With a gesture. With 3 men who saw an enemy and chose to walk away without a word. That silence contained everything. Recognition. Mercy. Humanity. A choice to let someone live when killing would have been easier. A moment when the machinery of war paused and human conscience reasserted itself. A gift given wordlessly, carried silently, remembered privately, lost to history. But real. Absolutely real. And absolutely consequential. The war ended 79 years ago. The men who fought it are nearly all dead now. The memories are fading. The stories are being lost. But the choices those men made, the moments when they chose mercy over murder, humanity over dehumanization, life over death, those choices had permanent consequences. They saved lives. They created futures. They demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances, individual humans retain the capacity for decency. We remember World War II as the worst thing humans have done to each other. We should. It was. But we should also remember that even in that worst thing, individual humans kept making individual choices to be better than the circumstances required. Kept choosing mercy. Kept recognizing enemies as human. Kept affirming that conscience survives even when everything tries to destroy it. 3 German soldiers walked away from a Soviet lieutenant on January 17, 1943. They gave him life without a word. That gift echoed forward through 79 years. Through a daughter who never knew the story. Through grandchildren who exist because mercy was shown to their grandfather by enemy soldiers. Through this moment of recognition that war couldn't entirely erase. The story was lost. The moment was forgotten. But it happened. It mattered. It matters still.